This is lesson number 15 for metal technology. It's over sand casting. It's in chapter 14 of the Modern Metal Working Book, pages 211 to 228. As always, stop this presentation when you need to write down your descriptors and draw your images. Casting is the forming of metal objects by pouring molten metal into a mold. So if you look at the top right here, the foundry is the area in which the casting is done. So it's a specialized area. So what we do is we will do casting in the foundry. A pattern is a model for making a mold in which a molten metal is poured for casting. So this is the actual pattern of what we want to look at, or what we want to make. So this would be something that we have to either make out of a plastic or wood, or take a previous pattern so we can put it into the sand that we're going to use to actually make our mold itself. So the pattern, if you don't have a pattern, you're not going to be able to do a casting. The flask is what your project is actually going to be made in. So we are going to fill this with sand, and we are going to have the pattern on the inside. So where the pattern is at on the inside, obviously there's not going to be any sand. And when we take these two things apart, we'll be able to pour our metal into that, and as it cools, it's going to solidify. After it solidifies, we're going to break the sand out, and then we'll have our solid metal piece. The flask has two parts, the cope and the drag. The cope is the top part of the flask, and the drag is the bottom part of the flask. So this is two pieces, and you do have to match them. So if you are going to make a mold, if you're doing a casting project, you need to make sure that you have the matching pieces, because a lot of them, even though they're the same size, will match just a little bit differently. Sprues, this is where you are going to actually pour the metal. So you have to cut these things in. When you cut these things in, you're using a pipe or a little tube here. Obviously this person's hand is on the mold here where the sand is. So you've got to give the sand, or excuse me, you've got to give the metal a place to go. So it's got to be able to run through these tubes and into whatever pattern you have. You also need to have an outlet hole. Runners, or we call these gates a lot of the times. When you have a runner, you have to have a spot from which the metal goes from the sprue and into the actual pattern itself. So whatever this part is in here, whatever this person is making, they had to pour the metal into the sprue. You had to cut a little area so the metal could run into your mold cavity, and then eventually it's going to run out of the top. This is what's called a riser. Parting compound in this bottle here, it's very similar to, the best thing I can describe is like baby powder. It's a real fine white powder. It's going to keep mold from sticking, and it's going to allow your pattern to come apart. So once your pattern is in your mold, you're going to have to eventually extract that and pull that out. And when you do that, it's a lot easier to do if you've used this parting compound. This next part here, this is called a riddle. All this does is sift sand. So you're going to use this to actually put your sand in. So you're going to literally shovel sand onto this, and you're just going to push it and work it down through this. So what this does, this is going to catch anything, any type of foreign object that got into the sand, and it's also going to help get the sand really fine. So when you do go to pack your sand down, it packs a lot easier. So you definitely need to make sure that when you are doing your mold, you run all of your sand through a riddle. This next guy up here is called a rammer. in our class we're going to have one like this. This is a wooden rammer, and we also have a metal one. All this does is you take this, you put your hand in this part here, you'll grab that part there, and you will actually start hammering the metal down, or the sand down. So you're packing the sand really tightly around whatever mold you have. So again, you're grabbing here and you're actually pounding the sand down. The striker or strike off bar is this thing here that this person has in their hand. So as you can see, what they're doing is they're removing all of this excess sand from the mold. So it should be really nice and smooth by the time you're done. So it's a straight bar that you use to just kind of saw and wobble back and forth to get the excess sand off. Gates, same thing, very similar to a runner. The gate has to allow the metal in. So if you are pouring this down, if you're pouring this molten metal down through your sprue and into your runner, if it doesn't go through the gate, it's not going to get into the mold cavity. So once you have your gate, it's the open area where you can actually reach. It's the only area that you're actually going to be able to reach your mold cavity. This next picture up here is something called bellows. These molding bellows, what you do, you would squeeze these down, and as you squeeze those down, it compresses air and it shoots the air out of the end. So it's going to allow the air to kind of shoot out and actually go through and just blow dust and dirt or sand or whatever it is that you are trying to clean off of your project. Sometimes you need to use a little extra parting compound, and that's getting in the way. You just may need to blow that stuff off. The crucible furnace, this is where all the heat is going to come from. So this is obviously a cartoon version, but what happens is this part is removable. This is where your metal will actually go in and sit as it is getting ready to melt. So all around this outside ring is where all the heat is going to come from. So when you turn on this crucible furnace, it's going to almost sound like a jet engine. It's going to have a real heavy rushing sound, and it's going to cause a bunch of flames to circulate around this crucible. So to wrap up the last lesson here, what objects can you think of that have been made by casting? This is an example of an engine block. This is probably, from the looks of it, it's a cast aluminum block. Most of the older engines were made out of cast iron. So think about something that was casted, give an example of what it is, and kind of explain how it's used. That's it for lesson 15. Again, as always, if you have any questions, please make sure you stop and ask. Rewatch this as many times as you need, and don't forget the workbook assignment for lesson 15.